In the fall of 2022, I traveled to Ireland to do some research into the Irish border. As it happened, I grew up there, and I was interested in a lot of the things that make a border different. One of those, for example, is the fact that people are very closely connected with people on the other side of the border, in fact, more so than they are with people on their own side of the border very often. And in particular, in the Irish border, you may be aware that there's been a lot of trouble and violence over the years. And a lot of that has been related to, if you like, cultural differences between the Protestant and Catholic communities. So I was very interested in all these issues and how they have, changed in particular over the last 30 to 50 years. And so for that purpose, ethnography was an ideal method. And so that's what I did when I went to Ireland. We'll talk about that in a little more depth later. What we're going to do in this lecture is talk about what ethnography is, what its relevance is to design and innovation. We're going to talk then about culture, because culture turns out to be really fundamental, depending on how you sort of talk about culture and subculture and so on. We'll talk about some of the methods of ethnographic research. We will talk about the mindset behind it, which is quite different from what you may be used to from quantitative research. And we'll finish up by talking about the key issue of insight, which is what really we're trying to get at when we do ethnographic research. Ethnography, then, is the study of people and cultures. So it's fundamental to design, because if you want to understand what makes a product tick, or whether a design or an experience, a service, and so on is going to appeal to people, you kind of need to understand what those people are all about and what makes them tick. So it's a holistic approach, and what it does is it studies, if you like, cultural systems. This is pure ethnography. We'll talk a little bit about how designers have modified it to make it their own. But it's the study of socio-cultural contexts, processes, and meanings within cultural systems. And there are two important terms. There are what are called emic perspectives and etic perspective. An emic perspective is studying a single culture in depth. And so, for example, if I had gone into a Protestant community and spent 6 months there and lived there in that community without really comparing it with anything else, I would get some in-depth perspectives into that culture. Etic perspectives are where you do cross-cultural comparisons. You're interested in cultural differences. And one of the more amusing ones that I came across is that when I talked to Catholics in Northern Ireland and to ask them what was different about Protestants, they said, oh, well, Protestants keep their toasters in the cupboard. And apparently toasters in the cupboard was a way of saying Protestants are tidy and neat. They keep tidy, neat homes, where Catholics don't necessarily do that. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that's what people thought. It is very much dependent on field work. So you really are, as an ethnographer and a design researcher, you're out there in the field talking to people, and it's very much a question of doing a lot of talking, or doing more listening than talking, but being out there and dealing with people. And from that you make inferences, you continue with all kinds of inquiries. So it happens over a period of time. And it goes back and forward. It's iterative, because as you do things, you'll learn. And as you learn things, you're going to want to find out, you're going to want to go back to the previous stage, for example, to see, is there something that we missed in that previous stage? It's emergent, and it's very flexible and really creative, which is, I guess, why I particularly love it. So exactly what is it? Well, it grew out of anthropology and sociology. It's still the primary method of research for anthropologists and sociologists. And as I've said, it emphasizes the importance of culture. And the fundamental method is direct observation and interviewing, but direct observation of users in their natural environment. So it's sort of trying to disrupt things as little as possible and seeing what people do. Right, and see what they and how they think. The kind of data you use for it are things like field notes, interview transcripts, tapes or digital recordings, video, any personal documents you may come across, artifacts, which are objects that you pick up on the way. And importantly, and we've talked about this in some of the overview of research, its purpose is not to predict anything. Its purpose is to understand it, right? So what you're looking for is in-depth insight, not necessarily somebody's going to do the next thing, although you might infer that at some point. And the methods, primary methods, are observation and interviews. And so then what we do as designers is we try to understand users in depth, and that's fundamental to design. And that means that we try to understand their world, right? So we immerse ourselves in the experience itself. We observe what people are doing. We do what's called semi-structured interviewing. We'll talk about that particular process in another lecture. And we collect objects and artifacts. To give you an example of the kind of immersion that might be involved, in another project some years ago, I was studying what people thought about vaccines. This is long before COVID, but even then, there was quite a lot of hesitancy about vaccines. So what I did was I went and had a vaccination, right? And so in the clinic, not only did I understand what it felt like to go and have a vaccination, I could actually talk to the people who were there in the waiting room. There was nothing to do but talk to me, so that was pretty easy. And I could also talk to the staff while they were actually prepping me and injecting me and so on. So those kinds of things, just sort of getting yourself involved in things with the objective of really putting yourself in the user's shoes. That's very much how designers use ethnography. The kind of thing we're looking for is what's called thick description. So it's really rich descriptions that are full of detail and insight about what people do. We're very much looking for stories and narrative, and we're looking for, as designers or as innovators in business, we're looking to create empathy, to really understand the world that users live in and where they're coming from. Culture then, as I've mentioned culture a couple of times, it is very fundamental. And what culture is in a broad sense is how societies regulate, whether consciously or unconsciously, they regulate behavior and social interaction. If you take religion as one type of culture, you can see how religion is all about regulating how people behave around the certain rules that you have, going to church regularly, going to confession or to mass, etc., etc., and social interaction. How do people relate to each other? Again, that's regulated quite strictly in religious cultures, and then in some other cultures that it's a lot looser. It also provides the frame. I mean, it's the kind of thing that's there, but it's like the air. You don't necessarily know it's there, but it provides the frame and the lens through which we review the experience of life, or in the case of design, the product, services, and experience that we use, right? And it's not just about national culture. I mean, there's Canadian culture, there's American culture, British culture, Irish culture, Asian cultures. But in a big multicultural country like Canada, it's also about subcultures, and that's increasingly the case around the world, because there are very few countries left now that have completely homogenous cultures. People have traveled and settled all over the world, and so there are always little pockets of people who've moved from somewhere else, and they would constitute a subculture because their values, ideas, and perspectives are different from the mainstream. Within business, we think often about consumer cultures, and these are tribes, another term for them, and I'll talk about those in a moment, but they operate as subcultures. And then another type of culture is, of course, organizational cultures, right? So each organization has its own set of cultural norms and unwritten rules, et cetera, and understanding those is important. So it's a really critical way of understanding lived experience. And if we understand lived experience, we can then understand how to innovate around that lived experience. Tribes, as I mentioned, are a type of subculture. Tribes these days they're kind of brand communities. We've talked, for instance, about Harley Davidson and the Harley Davidson Creed. That's very much a tribe and a subculture of its own. And so these would be groups that share a common passion. And you find that all over the internet, there are people who've coalesced into groups, into interest groups, and very often you could consider those a tribe by the fact that they have certain values, they have certain passions, and they have certain rules of engagement. And that's what binds the group together and provides them with a sense of belonging. Steve Jobs was famously cynical about user research, and so the second quote there is from Steve Jobs. It's people don't know what they want until you show it to them. That's why I never rely on market research. And here's the kicker. Our task is to read things that are not yet on the page. Right? So if you go out and you simply ask people, what do you need? You can get a lot of blank stares, or if people can think of something, they'll say, yeah, I need this product to be cheaper, or I need it to be better in this following, I need these other features. If you've done that, if you get that kind of information, you can be sure that your competitors have got it too, right? Because that's a very obvious way of finding information. What you have to do is to go out and really understand how people live. And from there, you can infer how you might be able to improve their life and their experience. And that's where that's where I don't part company with Steve Jobs. I think he was right in a lot of what he was saying, but I don't think it was necessarily clear. Research plays a fundamental role, but not the traditional kind of research where you're just trying to find out what everybody already knows. I mentioned we'd talk about methods, and there are three principal methods, and there are lots of variations around those. So those three principal methods are observation, interviews, and immersion. So in observation, you're watching people, either use a product. You could go into homes and watch people take a can of soup from the cupboard and open it, and all the various little details that happen around that. Or you could watch Harley Davidson riders as they modify their bikes. You could watch how people negotiate in a car dealership. You could accompany people on a shopping trip. So there are many ways that you can observe people, either when they're aware of it or when they're not aware of it. Guerrilla ethnography, if you like, is being out on the street and just watching people, right? So this is the kind of ethnography where they're not necessarily aware that you're watching, but just sort of observing how people, for instance, interact with their phones and then taking notes on that. Interviews then you can have interviews with all kinds of people, users, non-users, experts. The one I want to highlight is extreme user interviews. So that's the idea that instead of just going for the average user, you might find there's a lot to be gained from going for people who are at the sort of extremes. Some years ago, I did a study on recycling, and we found that it was really interesting to look at people who were fanatical recyclers. They stayed awake half the night thinking about, now, where does that can go? Does it go into the recycling, does it go into the garbage, etc.? So that would be one end of things. And the reason we would do that is that those people have got little routines and shortcuts and workarounds and so on that we could learn from, that could be then shifted into the mainstream to improve recycling all around. Then again, you could look at the extreme non-recyclers, the people who just throw everything in the garbage, and take a look at, what are the leverage points for those people where we might be able to shift them along. So instead of looking at the middle, it's often a good thing to look at the extreme end of things. Immersion then is actually, as it implies, immersing yourself in the experience. Auto-ethnography is one way of doing that, which is, to give you an example, I had a design colleague who was going through some knee surgery, and he was in healthcare. He was doing design for healthcare, and so what he did was he kept a journal of his knee surgery. Most of the time, he took pictures too. Most of the time, he was taking pictures of the ceiling, which sounds kind of weird, but if you think about it, as a patient, all you see is the ceiling because you're lying down. And just as a really interesting twist on that, I once had a dentist in Toronto, and you'd lie back in the chair and you'd look up, and what she had was on the ceiling were all the postcards she'd received from her patients around the world. So at least you had something to look at and something to read. But she could see that if all you were doing was lying on in a chair for hours, at least it was something that could distract your attention from what she was doing in your mouth. So auto-ethnography, in any case, is a really interesting method of really exploring an experience on your own, yourself. Mystery shopping then is actually going into, if you're doing a study of a retailer, for example, going in as a customer to that retailer without telling them that you're a researcher, and just seeing what happens and seeing whether you can find some pain points. Field work has been called bare knuckle confrontation. I think it's not a great term because we're not trying to confront anybody here, right? What we are trying to do is empathize with them and understand them. Sometimes that might mean you'll have to provoke a bit to try and really understand a phenomenon. But essentially, what it is being very directly engaged with your respondents or your users. What you want are respondents that are representative and reliable. As we've just said, they might be extreme, not necessarily typical. You want to research in an appropriate location. And by that, the general rule here is try to research as close to the context of use or purchase as you can. So if you're interested in how do people buy cars, go to a dealership. If you're interested in how do people drive cars, ride around with people and talk to them as you're doing it, right? So the point being researching context as much as you can, because if you do that, then you'll find that people come up with all kinds of things that they wouldn't necessarily come up with if you just sort of talk to them in a coffee shop or something. And in addition, you can observe what they're doing, which they would not necessarily be conscious of. There are ethics involved here. You need to respect the privacy of respondents. You need to develop rapport. You need to be honest with people, fair and dispassionate, and to the extent that you can, record without bias, and of course respect the integrity of the place that you're doing the research. I would use user observation as a general rule. I would use it when you can't rely on people to tell you. It's not that they're unreliable, but there's a lot of the stuff they just don't know, right? They live through some of the pain points in life, and they're not even aware of them, or they can't articulate them. But life would be a lot better if they weren't there, for example. They may want. There are times when people want to conceal what the true answer is. For example, if you do studies on people's diet, they'll tell you that their diet is much healthier than it actually is. If you do studies on smoking, they'll tell you that they smoke a lot less than they actually do. And the only way of getting at the true information is to watch what they do over a period of time. Or the behavior that they're doing might be automatic, like driving, right? Or going and getting gas at a gas station. Those kinds of things you can, again, users aren't aware, but you can see all kinds of things as a designer. And there are many cultural patterns that, as I've mentioned, cultures like the air, right? And so a lot of patterns are actually beneath the surface. Interviewing then, what you want to do, I mean, the whole purpose of it is to understand what people think and feel, right? That may not always be the most relevant thing, but you kind of need to know it. If you observe something, you kind of need to understand why they do it if they're aware of it. So that's one reason to interview. So interview where, first of all, you can't see what they're thinking, right? So they might do something. They might throw a particular can in the garbage as opposed to in the recycling, and you might not understand why that is. So you can ask. You might understand the why of what underlies the behavior. There are obviously certain behaviors that you can't easily, or at least ethically, observe. Obviously, if you're doing a study on toilet paper, you're not going to observe that. You're going to go and talk to people. You want to hear reactions. If you've got a new product, you want to maybe show it to them and see what happens, right? Do they jump for joy? Are they indifferent? So all the body language that goes with that would be important. And you need to, if you've got a hypothetical situation, suppose we introduced a new Disney type experience in education, for example, and then you could get their reaction to that, and even get some ideas from it. Here's an example of a sort of study that we did, and this was quite cool. This was with Dossier Creative in Vancouver, and it was with an auto dealer. What they were interested in was the experience of car buyers as they went to the dealership and dealt with the salespeople. What we got them to do was to go out with their phones, and if they were buying a car, to take pictures as they went, and just upload those pictures to Evernote. And then what we did then as a team was to go through the pictures. We sent people questions, right? So once we had a look at the pictures, we would ask, well, why did you take this picture? What did it mean to you, etc. And we got them to upload their answers again to Evernote. So that gave us a kind of database that we could work with. And then from there, we could start to draw links between things and see, we could classify what types of car buyers answered things in this way, what types of car buyers answered them in that way, what kinds of things were they looking for in a car dealership, what were the shortcomings of that experience, okay? And what we found, of course, was that the dealerships are very much set up as they were in the 1950s. It's the salesman with the suit and tie, etc. But 90% of the purchase process actually happens outside the dealership.
But you can go way beyond.
Just in terms of mindset, one thing that Albert Einstein said, which is very significant, I'm neither clever nor especially gifted. I'm only very, very curious. And that's actually reassuring for us as innovators, because what it's saying is all you need is curiosity, right? You don't need a whole lot of, you don't need to be brilliantly creative. Curiosity and the desire to find things out and learn things is super important. There's a rich history and philosophy in ethnography. I won't spend a massive amount of time on it, but of course, you'll have heard of people like Margaret Mead, and for her, culture was the primary determinant of human character. Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, there are others, Husserl and Weber, all of whom sort of built this history of ethnography, and I encourage you to start reading up on some of that if it interests you. What you'll find is that this is a very, very different way of thinking and looking at the world from the standard sort of quantitative scientific method. It is equally scientific, though. But ethnographic research, as implied by the quotation from Einstein, they have this mind of a child, and it's curiosity. It's the question why. If you've got a 3 to 5 year old, you'll note that they're always asking why, and that's partly because they don't know the fundamental things that we all take for granted. And so as researchers, that's what we're trying to do, is to try to understand what is it that our users are taking for granted, and really to be curious about it. Empathy comes into it. We do need a certain humility. So we're not going in saying, hey, we know what this product category is all about. We know what this service is all about. But what we really want to know is how they see it, because that's the stuff that matters, and not what we know that matters. And we need to be open to hearing things that may be critical, or things that are just completely unexpected. Emotional data is a big part of this too, and so that being aware of and encouraging people to talk about their emotions and being empathetic enough to allow an open space for them to do that is an important part of it. Great ethnographers are great listeners above all, right? And you need details, so sometimes you're going to have to probe, and a certain amount of naivety doesn't hurt, right? Because you're sort of trying to approach this with as clean a slate as you can. We'll talk about flexibility as we talk about research planning, but the idea here is that you don't necessarily go in with question 1, question 2, question 3, and so on. You may loop around, you may skip a question altogether if it doesn't seem relevant, or you may change the order, etc., etc. Empathy and insight. Empathy then is the capacity to recognize somebody else's state of mind, and in other words, put yourself into someone else's shoes. Insight then is a subtle concept, and I think it's I'm going to spend a bit of time on it because it is incredibly important in design. It can be used, I mean, this is a definition from the internet, uses several related meanings: a piece of information, the act or result of apprehending the inner nature of things, seeing intuitively, the power of acute observation and deduction, penetration, discernment, introspection. So it's this briefly, it is this aha moment where you say, I understand what that comment was all about. I understand where that fits into the bigger scheme of things. You can get insight from all kinds of things, right? So for instance, what stages do people go through? Do they make mistakes? We call them mistakes. Often they're just workarounds, right? That people, if a piece of software is clunky, people will find a workaround in order to make life easier for them. Well, why is the software clunky? Why don't you fix it so that it's not clunky? How do they combine products in novel ways? Any home remedies? Do they create their own products? Do they modify their own products, right? So for example, Harley Davidson users, the classic Harley Davidson sound arises from the mistiming or the misfiring of the engine. Well, in fact, what Harley riders have done for decades is to tune their engines in such a way that they'll make that kind of noise, right? And that was how Harley decided to have this kind of unique loud noise that comes from a Harley by just watching what users do. Maybe there's some benefits here that you don't know about. Maybe there's some body language that tells you people are bored or annoyed or overjoyed by the experience. What did they talk about? Maybe you can do things like what are called walkthroughs, or you can get people to talk as they're going through an experience. And so take note of what they're doing, because they'll describe their steps to you. Do they divide labor? Do they share it? Where do they use the product? What do they see as unachievable? Here's one, this is the kind of question that might come to you, right? If you were doing a research for shower heads, this actually comes from a showerhead company, people found, or the researchers found, that people languish in the shower. They spend time in the shower. Why do they do that? Maybe it's because it's an escape from the world. It's their own private moment when nobody's bothering them. Maybe it's a purification ritual, right? So almost like a religious thing, like a baptism type of thing. Maybe it's a sensual moment, right? So the point is, if you observe something like that, people are spending like 10, 20 minutes in the shower, that should make you curious, right? And so that kind of curiosity can get you to asking questions around the reason behind it, and that people may not even be aware of or prepared to talk about. So that's what this is about. Ask yourself some things. What makes you curious? What do you not expect? What might, that's pretty ingenious when you see it, or what might seem dumb or odd to you, but might make sense if you look at it differently. What are users assuming, right? You may have very different set of assumptions about a product from users. And what do they not say, but the fact they don't say it seems significant. And then all of the body language, expressions, smells, and sounds, what do they reveal in combination with what they say and what they do? Here are a few examples of observations that lead to insight. So the idea that people, as the California Milk Processing Board found, people actually ration milk. So the idea that, and you must have had it in your household, where people say, "Oh, we don't have enough milk. Let's just not have a cup of tea this morning, or let's save the milk so that we can use it for our cereal." So the insight there, the observation, you see that people, through an ethnographic process, you see people are rationing milk. You hear them say these things about let's save the milk. The insight then is, for some occasions, such as cereal, milk is so essential that you can't afford to be without it. And that was what gave rise to the Got Milk campaign, which was to imagine a world where you didn't have milk. People use insecticide baits and sprays at the same time. The baits are the kind of little poison that you get the insects, the ants, and so on to carry back into the nest. Except, of course, they cancel each other out, right? And so people, clearly, if they're using both the spray and which kills the insects so it can't go back to the nest, they mustn't understand that they do. So maybe you need clearer instructions. Languishing in the shower, showers a purification ritual, advanced shower head design. Pet treats are mostly bought by older people and younger children. This is from a book by Paco Underhill. And so what was found was that, in fact, younger people and children and older people couldn't reach them on the shelf because they tended to be either very high or very low. So the outcome from that was to place pet treats on a lower shelf. And in Turkey, laundry is separated by gender, so because of Islamic custom. So that would mean there was an opportunity then to have separate or special detergents for men's and women's clothes. So a couple of points to remember. Ethnography is the study of cultures and the impact of cultures on lived experience. And all experiences are mediated through the lens of culture, which people just may not be aware of. Ethnography is not just a set of methods, but it's a mindset. It's a way of thinking, in a very open, flexible, empathetic way. And there are two broad methods, observation and interview. We talked about a third one also, which is immersion. But ultimately, the whole point is to look for meaning and insight in human experience. And that in turn will give us the kind of basis that we have for design. Here are a few things as we leave this topic to think about, some provocations, if you like. If you wanted to conduct a study to understand the differences between young men and women and how they view online dating, what kind of challenges do you think would arise? And what would you do to deal with them? Secondly, what kinds of data could you collect by using Facebook? Can you give an example of a project where Facebook would be a useful tool and describe how you'd use it? And then the third one to think about is, for practice in this, just take the bus to work or to school and make a point, just look around and observe what people do. What makes you curious, right? Is there something odd about what people are doing? And can you come up with any insights then about how people use public transportation? So we'll leave ethnography there. It's a really rich area. I encourage you to read up more about it. It's absolutely fascinating, and the best thing about it for me is that it really provides you with this canvas where you can do research in creative ways, and those creative ways can generate some really interesting insights.